So I thought what I would do is basically go over some of the state of the art, basically, when it comes to scholarship on the Mediterranean. And as I was thinking about my talk today, it occurred to me that almost every academic research proposal really should begin with three basic questions. What is the problem at hand? Why is the problem at hand, in effect, a problem? And finally, how do we propose to address said problem? And if we are to apply these basic premises to our workshop, they would translate into questions along the lines of what makes the Mediterranean world a legible unit of analysis for historians and social scientists? Or the counter question would be, is its historical coherence merely carved out of geography by human imagination? A second set of questions would be the following. Does the Mediterranean warrant specialized attention as a discrete geohistorical entity? And to paraphrase the module on the Mediterranean world history, does the Mediterranean have something distinctive to teach us about our common human heritage? And finally, what do we, as academics, scholars, students of the Mediterranean, actually know of the Mediterranean and its history? And why this presumptuous call now to reimagine it, which, after I wrote the title, I realized was pretty arrogant, but you have to take a leap of faith, right? So in the course of this workshop, our distinguished speakers, and I thank them all for participating in this workshop, will share with us their unique insights to illustrate how new research findings are challenging what we may know of Mediterranean history. They will discuss how scholars today may be reimagining or reframing the Mediterranean as a unit of analysis. And they will suggest new approaches for integrating the Mediterranean into world history. But obviously, before we reimagine or integrate the Mediterranean, we should try to define it and identify its regional and disciplinary contours. So my talk hopefully will give a brief overview of some concerns in the field of Mediterranean studies. And let me begin by saying that by the question why the Mediterranean, I do not mean to doubt the importance of the sea and its surrounding lands as a prominent arena of world history. Indeed, the Mediterranean is often said to have shaped the world. It was the cradle of civilizations. It is the birthplace of the monotheistic religions. It's often referred to as the navel of the world. So the question rather is whether we are justified in looking upon the Mediterranean as a world unto itself, as a self-enclosed geographical and, more importantly, cultural entity. So this satellite image reveals with great precision the geometric and the ecological outlines of the Mediterranean basin. But it can't tell us much about the spatial and the cultural parameters of what's known as the Mediterranean world. Where, according to this image, for example, does the Mediterranean begin and end? And what physical and human features can we attribute to this continent of land and water? At what point does the topography of the Mediterranean meld into that of Africa, Asia, or Europe? Now, granted, all continents are to some degree geographic expressions, cultural constructs, or literary inventions. But where lie the parameters of this watery continent that is the Mediterranean? And in response to these questions, some scholars have adopted a vantage point that radiates outwards from the sea. And they concluded that the Mediterranean consists quite plainly of the territories whose climate is impacted by the sea. Ellen Churchill Semple, for example, defined the Mediterranean lands as those upon which the sea bestowed its moisture. Now, this vantage point, looking from the sea outwards, has the benefit of rendering the Mediterranean world as a natural ecological unit, but it also endows the sea with disproportionate centrifugal powers. The sea tends to define the lands that surround it. Another problem with this vantage point is that it tends to take for granted that the ecology of the Mediterranean is timeless and unchanging. And this is a notion that was very brilliantly revised by our late colleague, Farouk Tabak, who showed how waves of vegetal migrations have substantially altered the ecological layout and the floral composition of the sea over time. So perhaps the sea is not so governing after all. And let's consider for a moment this satellite image, which situates the Mediterranean basin in relation to the Sahara. Here, the Mediterranean appears less as a focal system, as a focal ecosystem, sorry, and more as the northern extremity of the Saharan climatic regime. And as we will shortly hear later from my colleague, Professor Timothy Beach, one should not underestimate the climatic implications of Saharan dust and desertic aerosols on sedimentation, air quality, and temperatures in the Mediterranean countries. So this is also another view that challenges the central focus on the Mediterranean as making its own climate and its own environment. And as a result of these problems, other scholars like Paul Vidal de Rablache stress that the Mediterranean corresponds more to specific ways of life, and that any definition of the Mediterranean should also consider the impact of human behavior and human actions. So according to this view, a geographic region is also the making of modes of production and exchange, of movement and circulation by humans, commodities, and ideas. The Mediterranean becomes not only a geographic fact, but also a byproduct of connectivities and flows between the sea's multiple integrated microregions. And I'll go over these terminologies and the scholars who coined them. But this is basically a map that shows you that the Mediterranean Sea is in fact composed of many microregions and many seas. So one way to look at the Mediterranean Sea would be to say that it's a collection of seas. It's the Mediterranean seas in the plural. And in fact, the Mediterranean as a whole has been referred to by scholars as a meta-geographical space, whose unity has been forged by connections made and maintained between its multiple seas and its multiple microregions. So now the question is, how have historians, geographers, anthropologists, and ecologists made use of these different spatial understandings of the Mediterranean? And at the risk of oversimplification, we can summarize their approaches into two tendencies. And the first is what's known as the ecologizing approach, which is associated with Fernand Braudel, who's the towering figure in Mediterranean history. And Braudel defined the region in terms of the common topographic and ecological features of its surrounding lands, whose climate, soil, and vegetation were all influenced by the sea. Braudel had very famously delineated the boundaries of the Mediterranean climate as the lands encompassed between, quote, the northern limit of the olive tree and the northern limit of the palm grove, unquote. So this is a map that shows you Braudel's definition of the Mediterranean, somewhere between these two hash marks or dotted lines. But more importantly, in Braudel's shared ecosystem, human communities followed the common rhythms of seasonal variation and adapted similar patterns, behaviors, and habits in extracting subsistence from the sea and from the land. And so the ecologizing approach, therefore, explained the unity of the Mediterranean in terms of A, the physical peculiarities of its environment, but also in terms of commonalities in human behavior within that environment. This approach prioritizes what's known as history close to the soil, and in fact, and to the extent that it focuses as much on the Mediterranean Sea as it does on the Mediterranean hinterlands and the topography of the surrounding territories. Now, the second approach, commonly associated with Peregrine Horton and Nicholas Purcell, is known as the Interactionist. And according to the Interactionist approach, the unity of the Mediterranean is defined in terms of the ease of communications across the waters of the internal sea. And we must keep in mind that until very recent times, circulation across the Mediterranean meant maritime travel over the trunk routes of the Mediterranean. So what the interactionist approach tries to do is to overcome what has been perceived as ecological determinism in Brodel's ecologizing approach. And it explains the unity of the Mediterranean, again, not only in terms of connectivities, communications, and exchanges, but more importantly, it also says that the Mediterranean is not only defined by the impact of the environment upon human action, but also by the impact of human action upon the environment. It's more of a reflexive approach or definition to the Mediterranean. And in fact, Horton and Purcell were trying to provide a corrective to Brodel with this reflexive approach. But the contributions of Horton and Purcell are also significant in their attempt to establish the unitary and holistic history of the Mediterranean lands and peoples, independently of monocausality, whether that singular cause be the common ecology or an overarching political structure. Now, monocausality is the view that historical developments can be traced to a singular impulse, singular factor, or singular cause. And it's actually one of the paradigms that, in a sense, plagues Mediterranean history, specifically when it comes to dealing with non-European societies, in the sense that there's a monocausal approach to explaining developments in Africa, for example. It's saying that everything that occurs in Africa has been the outcome of an impulse that came from the Mediterranean world, if not from Europe. So Horton and Purcell here were trying to also challenge this monocausal approach to history. And their reasoning is that if the Mediterranean basin is indeed a series of interconnected microregions, then is Mediterranean history not also a collection of singular and sectorial histories with multiple centers and causes and storylines? So in a way, Horton and Purcell consider the notion of an integral, in a way, Horton and Purcell consider the notion of integral and unbroken Mediterranean Sea as the unwarranted legacy of imperial Rome. Before the rise of Rome, they contend the Mediterranean was understood either as an open sea or as an ensemble of smaller seas, whose names were most often taken from neighboring coasts or islands. But as the Romans gained political control over the body of water, they began to refer to it as the internal sea, or our sea, mare turnum, mare nostrum. And although complete political dominance of the whole Mediterranean by a single power has never happened again in quite the same way, the Roman Mare Nostrum still operates deeply in the imagination of Western scholars. And as proof of the mythical powers of the Roman Mediterranean, Horton and Purcell make two claims. First, that nowadays historians of classical Rome are alone in consistently treating the Mediterranean as a whole. Second, that few scholars this side of Brodel have capitalized on his notion of a unified Mediterranean as a means to transcend national, political, linguistic, or cultural categories. So in both cases, Horton and Purcell contend that scholars who are merely relating events that took place in the Mediterranean are mistaken to believe that they're actually writing the history of the Mediterranean. And that is one of the, should we say, they have a beef with that, really. It's one of the things they keep coming back to over and over again. And here is a quote from the book, The Corrupting Sea. The sea, its islands and countries that surround it, communicate across it, and share its climate still seem to many historians to be far less worth studying as a collectivity than is Europe, or the Middle East, Christendom, or Islam. For all the frequency with which it is referred to, or simply invoked on title pages, Mediterranean history is a division of the subject of history as a whole that has yet to achieve full articulacy or recognition. When Mediterranean history is undertaken, moreover, it is often narrowly conceived as history in rather than of the region, piecemeal or abstracted from its locale, as a subtly emphasis within the usual limits of European history. Now, there are many accusations in this excerpt, which is one of the reasons I selected it, but the whole book is a fascinating read, although difficult at times. But part of the blame, I will argue, must surely lie with Brodel himself. Because while Brodel may have been unique in insisting that the environmental unity of the Mediterranean Sea had molded the civilizations that grew up on its shore, his study, for all its depth and majesty, struggled to overcome the conventions of a false historical paradigm. It also extended the lifespan of a second worn-out paradigm, and finally it facilitated the entrenchment of a third. And believe it or not, all three issues are by and large encapsulated in this quote, which I'll ask you now to memorize as I finally come to the question, why reimagine the Mediterranean? So of the three paradigms, the one that still serves as a counter-narrative to Brodel is the thesis that was developed in the 1920s by the Belgian historian Henri Pirenne, author of the booklet Muhammad and Charlemagne, in which he revised the prevailing ideas concerning the decline of European civilization after the fall of Rome in 476. Now, Pirenne argued that the Germanic invasions that ended the Western Roman Empire did not lead to the end of the unified Mediterranean and subsequently the decline of European civilization. He claimed rather that economic and cultural life continued after the collapse of the empire, for while the Germanic barbarians had destroyed the political and military power of Rome, they still preserved the Roman and Christian way of life. So the real break in European history and Mediterranean history, as far as Pirenne is concerned, occurred much later, in the 8th century, as a result of the Arab conquest of the Mediterranean basin. And specifically, the Arab conquests of North Africa, Iberia, and Sicily had cut Europe off from the Mediterranean and from Mediterranean trade, and as a result, had drained the region of its wealth and resources. And as a result of the steady decline and impoverishment of Mediterranean Europe, political power migrated north, away from the Mediterranean, and eventually, in the north, the Frankish Empire, which was based almost entirely on its agrarian economy, emerged as the dominant power north of the Alps. And what has since been known as Pirenne's thesis, therefore, was his famous conclusion that without Islam, the Frankish Empire would have probably never existed, and Charlemagne, without Muhammad, would be inconceivable. And I'll talk about this a little bit tomorrow, but archaeological evidence and all sorts of historical research shows Pirenne's thesis to be largely unfounded, but it remains influential upon a body of scholarship that still regards the late 7th century as the beginning of a political, religious, and social cultural fragmentation of the Mediterranean basin between these two large entities, Christendom on one hand, Islam on the other. Second, in making his case for Mediterranean unity, Brodel had focused on the reign of King Philip of Spain, King Philip II of Spain, whose father, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, had politically unified a substantial part of the Western basin. Now, this is the political map with which Brodel was working, and it points to the unfortunate Eurocentrism that permeates his scholarship once he descends to the level of human events. Brodel is excellent when it comes to the large structural view of the Mediterranean, but once he comes down to political and human events, there's a very strong Eurocentric slant to his work. Now, for historians of the non-European world, or specifically historians of the Arab Muslim world, Brodel may have been far more justified in titling his book The Mediterranean and the Mediterranean World in the age of Mehmed III, because there are very valid historical reasons to consider Mehmed's great-grandfather, Suleiman the Magnificent, as the more effective architect of Mediterranean political unity in the the late 16th century. In fact, by the time of his death in 1566, Suleiman had established control over much of the eastern, central, and southwestern Mediterranean basin. And so here's a map that shows you that while Brodel was considering the orange, right, as the background to his argument for political unity and environmental commonalities, he tended to ignore, or at least tended to give less priority to what you see in purple, right, the Ottoman Empire. So Brodel's Eurocentric lens is one of the primary motivations for wanting to reimagine the Mediterranean or Mediterranean history as something more than a sub-chapter of West European history, and to regard its unity as something other than the victim of Muslim-Christian rivalries. As to the paradigm that was facilitated by Brodel's work, it is the tendency to consider the late 16th, early 17th centuries as the close of the Mediterranean chapter in world history. Until then, the Mediterranean held center court in the world economy and in world history. At least that's how it's perceived, and that view, by the way, is also debatable. And the works here of Andre Frank come to mind on the importance of Asia and China in the world economy. But according to this view, the Mediterranean was one of the primary engines of the world economy up until the late 16th century, when it was gradually supplanted by transatlantic commerce, and in the ensuing centuries, the sea entered a period of unrelenting decline. Now, on this paradigm, the title and the opening lines of Farouk's compelling book, which I mentioned earlier, The Waning of the Mediterranean, urge us to reimagine the history of the sea after the 17th century. And he writes that in the historiography of the Mediterranean region, this shared unitary history rapidly fades into obscurity past the region's prime, past the early 17th century, to be precise. For most scholars, it was then that the steady shift in the terminus of the spice trade from the Levant to the ports on the Atlantic and North Sea was finally sealed to the benefit of the latter. The conventional designation of the close of the 16th century as the onset of the Mediterranean's Gilded Age has not been without ramifications, however. Rare, if not outright extinct, as a result, have become ecumenical histories of the inner sea in studies chronicling developments from the turn of the 17th century. And here, Purcell and Horton agree almost in a letter. They actually look at Mediterranean history as two sequences. Mediterranean history before Brodel and Mediterranean history after Brodel. That for them is a turning point. Now, on this note, how many of us take, for example, for granted the marginalization of the Mediterranean following the shift of the world economy towards transatlantic trade? This is a marginalization that was further compounded by the rise of nation-states and eventually by the processes of uneven globalization. So much so that in the course of the 20th century, much of the verdict on the Mediterranean region is that it has been disintegrated to a considerable extent, and that the network of its micro-ecologies have been radically reconfigured by the involvement of its coastal nations in the credit economies, political alliances, technologies, and communications networks of the North and West and Far East. This is a quote, actually, from The Corrupting Sea. So this is also a narrative that is problematic because it dovetails almost too neatly into the story of Europe. And recent studies of the microregions of the Mediterranean, studies that have focused on cities or smaller entities, islands in the Mediterranean, are telling us a very different tale from this larger narrative about the waning of the Mediterranean past the late 16th century. And so the importance really of integrating the Mediterranean into world history, the importance of reimagining the Mediterranean is precisely to revisit such narratives by situating the Mediterranean within a larger framework of historical continuities across time and space, and more importantly, of stories that are written independently of lines and boundaries that are drawn by politics, modern politics and the politics of nation states. Otherwise, the Mediterranean will really tend to continue to be regarded as the civilizational barrier that demarcates Europe from Africa and the Middle East, Islam from Christendom